The chapel wasn't supposed to exist. It wasn't on any map, and no one in the nearby town of Black Hollow had mentioned it. But when Daniel Harlow stumbled upon the crumbling structure during his hike through the forest, it was as if the building had been waiting for him. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the bare trees, its weak light barely penetrating the thick canopy. The chapel stood in a small clearing, its stone walls weathered and cracked, its steeple leaning precariously. A single bell hung from the tower, its surface tarnished with age. Daniel felt a shiver run down his spine as he approached the building. The air around it felt colder, heavier, as though the chapel carried its own atmosphere of gloom. He wasn't supposed to be here. Daniel had come to Black Hollow to escape. The pressure of his city life, the endless deadlines, the sleepless nights, had pushed him to the brink. His therapist had suggested he take a break, find somewhere remote to clear his mind. The forest had seemed perfect, quiet, empty, and far away from the chaos of his life. But now, as he stood before the chapel, he felt anything but calm. Its stained glass windows were shattered, their jagged edges catching the fading light. The wooden doors were slightly ajar, the darkness within beckoning him. A faint sound drifted from inside, soft and melodic, like the hum of a distant choir. Daniel froze, his heart pounding in his chest. "Hello?" he called, his voice echoing faintly. The hum continued, rising and falling in a haunting rhythm. It wasn't music, exactly. It was more like a collection of voices, blending together in a way that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Against his better judgment, Daniel stepped forward. The wooden doors creaked as he pushed them open, the sound loud and jarring in the quiet forest. The interior of the chapel was dark, the faint light from the broken windows casting eerie patterns on the stone floor. And there, at the far end of the chapel, stood a choir. At first, Daniel thought they were statues. The figures were lined up neatly in the choir stalls, their heads bowed, their hands clasped in silent prayer. They were dressed in dark robes, their faces obscured by shadow. But as Daniel stepped closer, he realized they weren't statues. They were people, or at least they had been. Their skin was pale and waxy, their features frozen in expressions of sorrow. Cobwebs clung to their robes, and dust coated their still hands. They didn't move, didn't breathe. And yet, the hum continued, emanating from somewhere deep within the chapel. Daniel's chest tightened as he backed away, his instincts screaming at him to leave. But something about the figures held him in place, a strange compulsion rooting him to the spot. The hum grew louder, more insistent, as if responding to his presence. "Who are you?" Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible. The figures didn't answer, but as Daniel turned to leave, one of the figures moved. It was subtle, a slight tilt of the head, a faint twitch of the fingers, but it was enough to send a jolt of fear through him. "Stop it," Daniel muttered, his voice trembling. "You're imagining things." He turned toward the door, desperate to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the chapel. But as he took a step forward, the doors slammed shut with a deafening bang. Daniel spun around, his heart racing. The chapel was silent now, the hum replaced by an eerie stillness. And then one of the figures spoke. "You shouldn't be here." The voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it carried a weight that made Daniel's knees weaken. I didn't mean to intrude," Daniel stammered. "I'll leave. I'll go right now." The figure's head tilted further, its shadowed face turning toward him. "There is no leaving," it said. The other figures began to move now, their heads lifting, their hands unclasping. Daniel stumbled back, his breath coming in short gasps. The air around him grew colder, the light from the windows dimming until the chapel was bathed in shadow. "Please," Daniel said, his voice breaking. "I don't know what this is. I don't know why I'm here." The first figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. "You've heard the choir," it said, "and now you're part of it." Daniel shook his head, panic clawing at his chest. "No," he said, "I'm not part of anything. I don't belong here." "Yeah." The figure raised a hand, pointing toward the altar at the front of the chapel. "Then prove it," it said. Daniel's gaze shifted to the altar. A book lay open on its surface, its pages glowing faintly in the dim light. Strange symbols were etched into the parchment, their shapes shifting and writhing as though alive. The hum returned, louder now, resonating through the walls of the chapel. "Read," the figure said. Daniel's legs felt like lead as he approached the altar, his hands trembling. The air around the book pulsed with an unnatural energy, the symbols on its pages burning into his mind. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the parchment, and then the voices of the choir rose in unison, their song piercing and deafening. The symbols on the page began to glow, their light filling the chapel. Daniel's vision blurred, his head pounding as the voices swirled around him. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the light faded. The chapel was silent again, the figures frozen in place. Daniel stood at the altar, his hands trembling. The book was gone, but in its place was a single word, etched into the stone: return. Daniel stumbled out of the chapel into the darkening forest, his heart racing and his mind spinning. The word etched into the altar, return, burned in his thoughts, its meaning both simple and terrifying. Whatever he had awakened, whatever those figures were, they had tethered him to this cursed place. The forest was no longer the serene retreat he'd wandered into earlier. The air was thick and cold, and the shadows between the trees felt alive, shifting as if they were watching him. The sound of the choir's hum still echoed faintly in his ears, though he was far from the chapel now. "Just keep moving," Daniel muttered, gripping the straps of his backpack. "You'll find the trail. You'll get out of here." But the forest didn't seem to want him to leave. The path he had taken earlier was gone, replaced by dense thickets and uneven ground. The further he walked, the more disoriented he became, the trees blending into one another in an endless maze. And then faintly, he heard it again, the chime of a bell. Daniel froze, his pulse quickening. The sound was distant but unmistakable, the same bell he'd seen hanging in the chapel's steeple. He turned, his eyes scanning the forest. The sound seemed to come from all directions, reverberating through the trees. "Stop," he whispered to himself, his voice trembling. "It's not real." But the bell chimed again, louder this time. The forest began to change around him. The bare branches of the trees twisted and stretched, their gnarled limbs reaching toward the sky like skeletal arms. The ground beneath his feet grew softer, the snow melting into a thick, dark sludge. The air grew colder, the frost biting at his skin. And then, through the trees, Daniel saw a faint light. It flickered like a distant flame, casting long shadows across the forest floor. Against his better judgment, he stepped toward it. The light led him to a clearing, its center dominated by a stone pedestal. The pedestal was weathered and cracked, its surface covered in strange carvings that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. Resting atop it was a small, wooden box, its edges bound with rusted metal. The box pulsed with an unnatural energy, the faint hum of the choir growing louder as Daniel approached. He hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to turn back, but something about the box called to him, pulling him forward. Daniel reached out, his fingers brushing against the cold wood. The moment he touched it, a sharp pain shot through his head and his vision blurred. The choir's hum became a deafening roar, the voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony. Images flashed before his eyes, fragments of memories that weren't his own. He saw the chapel, its walls pristine and glowing with candlelight. He saw the figures in the choir stalls, their faces full of life and their voices harmonizing in a haunting melody. And then, he saw the priest. The man stood at the altar, his hands raised as he chanted in a language Daniel didn't recognize. The congregation watched in silence, their eyes wide with fear and reverence. The priest opened the box, and a blinding light erupted from within. The vision ended abruptly, and Daniel fell to his knees, gasping for air. The box on the pedestal was open now, its lid cracked and splintered. Inside was a small black orb, its surface smooth and impossibly dark, as though it absorbed all light. The air around him grew heavier, the darkness pressing in on him like a weight. The whispers of the choir returned, their voices soft but insistent. Take it. Take it. Daniel's hands trembled as he reached for the orb. The moment his fingers touched its surface, a wave of cold swept through him, and the whispers grew louder. The forest around him dissolved, replaced by the interior of the chapel. He was standing at the altar again, the figures in the choir stalls staring at him with their hollow eyes. The orb pulsed in his hands, its energy seeping into his skin. The first figure stepped forward, its movements stiff and unnatural. "You've taken the burden," it said, its voice echoing through the chapel. "What does that mean?" Daniel demanded, his voice rising in panic. "What is this thing?" The figure tilted its head. "It is the source," it said, "the heart of the choir, the reason we are bound." Daniel's chest tightened as the figures began to move, their heads tilting in unison as they stared at him. "You've chosen to take it," the first figure said, "and now you must decide." "Decide what?" Daniel asked, his voice trembling. The figure pointed toward the altar, where the black orb pulsed with a rhythmic glow. "To keep it," it said, "or to return it to the earth." The other figures raised their hands, their voices rising in a mournful chant. "Choose, choose, choose." Daniel felt a surge of panic as the orb grew colder in his hands. The hum of the choir filled the chapel, their voices echoing in his mind. He looked at the altar, then at the figures surrounding him. The weight of their stares was suffocating, their hollow eyes filled with silent desperation. "I don't understand," Daniel shouted. "What happens if I keep it? What happens if I return it?" The first figure stepped closer, its face inches from his. "If you keep it," it said, "the cycle continues. The burden remains." "And if I return it?" Daniel asked, his voice barely audible. The figure's expression didn't change. "Then the choir will end," it said, "and so will we." Daniel's mind raced as the choir's chant grew louder. He didn't know what to do, didn't understand the consequences of either choice. But the weight of the orb in his hands felt unbearable, its cold seeping into his very soul. He looked at the altar, then at the figures surrounding him. Their voices rose in a deafening crescendo, their hollow eyes pleading with him. And then he made his choice. The moment Daniel made his choice, the orb in his hands flared with a blinding light. The glow filled the chapel, casting jagged shadows on the walls and ceiling. The figures of the silent choir stopped their chant, their heads tilting in unison as they turned to face him. The first figure stepped closer, its hollow eyes fixed on Daniel. "It is done," it said, its voice low and resonant. The light dimmed, and the orb grew heavier in Daniel's hands, its once smooth surface now etched with faint, glowing symbols. "What happens now?" Daniel asked, his voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised a hand, pointing toward the chapel doors. The heavy wooden doors creaked open, revealing the dark forest beyond. Daniel hesitated, his heart pounding as the weight of the orb pressed down on him. The figures of the silent choir remained still, their hollow eyes watching him. "Go," the figure said. "The burden is yours now." Daniel took a shaky step forward, the cold air from the forest biting at his skin. He glanced back at the choir, their unmoving forms bathed in the dim glow of the orb. As he crossed the threshold of the chapel, the doors slammed shut behind him with a deafening boom. The forest was different now. The trees were darker, their twisted branches reaching out like claws. The path beneath Daniel's feet was overgrown, the snow melting into a slick, muddy trail. The orb pulsed faintly in his hands, its glow illuminating the shadows that seemed to shift and writhe around him. The air was heavy, the silence oppressive. But faintly he could hear it, the hum of the silent choir, distant but persistent, following him through the trees. He gritted his teeth, his grip tightening on the orb. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he couldn't stay here. As he stumbled through the forest, the hum grew louder, transforming into whispers that curled around him like smoke. "Daniel," the voices murmured, their tones soft and melodic. "You cannot run. You cannot hide." He shook his head, his breath coming in short gasps. "Leave me alone," he shouted, his voice echoing through the trees. The whispers didn't stop. Instead, they grew sharper, their words cutting through the air like knives. You chose the burden. Now bear it. The cycle must continue. The forest opened into a clearing, and Daniel froze. At its center stood another altar, identical to the one in the chapel. The stone was cracked and weathered, its surface covered in the same glowing symbols that now adorned the orb. The whispers grew louder, the air around him vibrating with their intensity. Daniel approached the altar, his legs trembling beneath him. The orb in his hands pulsed, its glow syncing with the rhythm of his heartbeat. As he reached the altar, the whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. And then the bell rang. The sound was deafening, reverberating through the clearing and shaking the ground beneath Daniel's feet. He stumbled, his hands clutching the orb as the bell's chime echoed in his skull. The symbols on the altar flared to life, their glow bright and searing. The air grew colder, the frost creeping across the ground and up the trunks of the surrounding trees. And then they appeared. The figures of the silent choir stepped into the clearing, their movements slow and deliberate. They surrounded Daniel, their hollow eyes fixed on him. You cannot escape, the first figure said, its voice sharp and final. The burden is eternal. The cycle must not be broken. Daniel's chest tightened as he stepped back, his grip on the orb faltering. I didn't ask for this, he shouted. I don't even understand what's happening. The figure tilted its head, its expression unreadable. You chose to take it, it said. You accepted the burden, and now you must decide its fate. Daniel's mind raced as he looked at the orb, its glowing symbols shifting and writhing beneath his fingers. What happens if I destroy it? He asked, his voice barely audible. The figures didn't answer. Instead, the first figure stepped closer, its hand outstretched. The cycle sustains us, it said. Without it, we fade. Without it, the choir falls silent. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. You're saying, if I destroy this, you'll all disappear? The figure nodded slowly. The choice is yours, it said. Keep the burden, and the cycle continues. Destroy it, and we are no more. The other figures began to chant softly, their voices rising and falling in a haunting melody. Choose, choose, choose. Daniel's hands trembled as he stared at the orb. If he kept it, the silent choir would remain trapped in their endless cycle, bound to the chapel in the forest. But if he destroyed it... What happens to me if I destroy it? He asked, his voice shaking. The first figure's expression darkened. You will take our place, it said. The burden does not disappear. It only changes hands. Daniel's stomach turned as the implications of their words sank in. He had come here seeking peace, but now he faced a decision that would define not just his life, but the fate of the silent choir. The whispers grew louder, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony. Choose, choose, choose. Daniel closed his eyes, his heart pounding. The orb in his hands pulsed faintly, its glow flickering like a dying flame, and then he made his choice. The clearing fell silent as Daniel opened his eyes, the orb glowing faintly in his hands. The figures of the silent choir surrounded him, their hollow eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his chest tighten. The weight of their expectations pressed down on him, their whispers hanging in the frozen air. I can't do this, Daniel said, his voice trembling. The first figure stepped closer, its presence cold and suffocating. The burden is not yours to reject, it said. You hold the cycle in your hands. Choose. Daniel stared at the orb, its shifting symbols mesmerizing and unnerving. The whispers of the choir grew louder, overlapping until they became a deafening roar. Daniel clenched his jaw, his thoughts racing. If he kept the orb, the silent choir would remain bound to this cursed place, their existence an endless loop of sorrow. But if he destroyed it, the cycle would end. And with it, the choir. The first figure's voice cut through the noise, low and commanding. Time is slipping, Daniel. The choice will be made for you if you hesitate. Daniel's grip on the orb tightened. He looked at the altar, the cracked stone glowing faintly beneath the weight of the decision. "I just wanted peace," he whispered. The figures tilted their heads in unison, their movements unnervingly synchronized. "Peace," the first figure said, its tone sharp. "There is no peace without sacrifice." The orb grew heavier, its light pulsating with an unnatural rhythm. The symbols shifted faster, their shapes burning into Daniel's vision. His hands trembled as he raised the orb toward the altar. The whispers surged, rising into a crescendo that made his ears ring. "End it," the voices urged, "or continue it." "No." Daniel's heart pounded as he lowered the orb onto the altar. The light flared, and the earth beneath him trembled. The figures stepped closer, their shadows stretching across the clearing. The first figure extended a hand, its skeletal fingers reaching for the orb. "Your decision shapes the balance," it said. "The weight is no longer yours alone." Daniel took a step back, his breath visible in the frigid air. "What happens if I destroy it?" he asked again, his voice breaking. The figure's hollow eyes bore into him. "The cycle ends," it said. "We are freed, but you remain, alone, bound to this place as its final guardian." "And if I don't?" Daniel pressed. The figure tilted its head. "We remain. The cycle continues. The burden is shared." Daniel felt his stomach turn as the reality of the decision pressed down on him. He thought of the visions he had seen, the choir alive, singing in harmony, their voices rich and beautiful. And then he thought of their hollow forms, trapped in an eternity of sorrow, their voices reduced to haunting whispers. "What are you?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Why are you here?" The first figure's expression darkened. "We are what you fear," it said. "We are what you might become. The orb binds us, and it binds you now. Decide, Daniel, or the decision will be made for you." The orb pulsed again, brighter this time, its glow illuminating the twisted faces of the choir. Daniel's breath came in short gasps as he reached for the orb, his fingers brushing against its cold surface. He thought of his life before this, of the endless deadlines, the sleepless nights, the suffocating pressure to escape. He had come to the forest seeking peace, but instead, he had found this. "Why me?" he whispered. The first figure stepped closer. "The forest chooses," it said simply. The whispers surged again, their voices blending into a single haunting chant. "Choose, choose, choose." Daniel closed his eyes, his chest tightening. If he kept the orb, he would share the burden with the choir, bound to the forest, but not alone. If he destroyed it, the choir would fade, and he would remain, alone, but free. Tears burned in his eyes as he lifted the orb once more. "I'm sorry," he whispered. The orb flared with a blinding light, its glow engulfing the clearing. The figures froze, their hollow eyes wide as the light washed over them. The whispers fell silent, replaced by a deafening stillness. When the light faded, the clearing was empty. The figures of the choir were gone, their forms dissolved into the air like smoke. The altar was cracked and dark, its surface cold and lifeless. Daniel stood alone, the orb gone from his hands. The silence was overwhelming, the weight of his choice pressing down on him like a physical force. He turned, his legs trembling, and walked back into the forest. The path was clear now, the trees no longer twisted and oppressive. The air was lighter, the frost melting beneath his feet. But the peace he had sought eluded him. The whispers of the choir lingered in his mind, their mournful song etched into his thoughts. He had ended the cycle, but at what cost? As he reached the edge of the forest, he glanced back. The chapel was gone, its crumbling walls and haunting bell erased from existence. But deep in the shadows of the trees, a faint hum began to rise. The edge of the forest felt like a boundary between worlds. Daniel stood there, staring at the open fields beyond, where the sunlight pierced through the thin veil of mist. It should have been a relief, a triumphant moment of escape. But his chest felt heavy, his steps faltering as if unseen hands still clung to him, dragging him back. Behind him, the forest loomed, dark and endless. The faint hum of the silent choir lingered in his ears, even though their figures had vanished. Daniel took a shaky breath and stepped out of the forest. The world outside was warm and alive, the snow glistening in the sun and birds singing faintly in the distance. It was a stark contrast to the suffocating cold and darkness he had just escaped. But it didn't feel real. Daniel's fingers brushed against his chest, where the orb had been. The weight of it was gone, but the absence was almost worse. It had left behind a hollow ache, as though it had taken a part of him when it disappeared. He walked aimlessly, the open fields stretching endlessly before him. The road back to Black Hollow should have been easy to find, but no matter how far he went, the village never appeared. The air grew colder as the sun dipped below the horizon. Daniel's breath puffed out in small clouds, his footsteps crunching in the frost-covered grass. The open fields had turned into an expanse of desolation, the horizon stretching endlessly, with no signs of civilization. And then, faintly, he heard it. The bell. It rang once, clear and mournful, cutting through the silence like a blade. Daniel froze, his heart pounding in his chest. "No," he whispered. "I ended it. I destroyed the cycle." But the bell rang again, louder this time. The air around him grew heavy, the faint light of dusk swallowed by creeping shadows. Daniel turned, his breath catching in his throat as the forest appeared behind him, closer than it had been before. The trees stood tall and menacing, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. The hum of the silent choir returned, soft and distant, growing louder with each passing moment. "No," Daniel said, backing away. "I'm not going back. I'm done." But the shadows surged forward, reaching for him like grasping hands. The forest swallowed him whole. Daniel stumbled, the ground beneath him soft and uneven as the trees closed in around him. The hum grew louder, transforming into a deafening roar. "Why?" he shouted, his voice cracking. "I made my choice. I ended the cycle." The whispers returned, their overlapping voices sharp and accusing. "You ended us, but not yourself." The words struck him like a physical blow, the weight of them pressing down on his chest. Daniel fell to his knees, his head spinning as the shadows writhed around him. The whispers softened, and the forest grew still. Daniel looked up, his vision blurry. He was back in the clearing where the altar had stood. But the altar was gone, replaced by a single stone marker, weathered and cracked. Carved into its surface was a name: Daniel Harlow. His blood ran cold as he stared at the marker. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "This isn't real." The shadows coalesced into a figure, its form tall and cloaked, its face obscured. "You ended the cycle for them," it said, its voice low and resonant. "But the burden remains. It cannot be destroyed, only transferred." Daniel's chest tightened as the figure stepped closer. "You took their place," it said. "You chose to break their chains, and now the weight is yours to bear." "No," Daniel said, backing away. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't know." "Knowledge changes nothing," the figure interrupted. "The forest chooses. The cycle continues, even without the choir." Daniel's hands trembled as he clutched at his chest, where the hollow ache had grown sharper, more intense. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice barely audible. The figure's head tilted, its form flickering like a dying flame. "You remain," it said, "bound to this place, the guardian of its silence." The forest shifted around him, the clearing dissolving into darkness. Daniel found himself standing at the edge of the chapel, its walls whole and pristine once more. The bell in the tower gleamed faintly, its surface untouched by time. The figures of the silent choir stood in the doorway, their faces blank and emotionless. "You will understand? In time," the first figure said. The chapel doors creaked open, and the figures stepped inside, their forms fading into the shadows. Daniel turned to leave, but his feet wouldn't move. The weight in his chest pulled him back, anchoring him to the ground. The bell tolled, its chime echoing through the forest. Daniel's breath came in shallow gasps as the chapel doors swung shut. The silence that followed was deafening, oppressive. He stood there, frozen, as the shadows of the forest crept closer, wrapping around him like a shroud. And then the hum began again. Soft at first, then louder, rising into a mournful melody that filled the air. Daniel's voice joined the choir, unbidden, his song blending with theirs in a haunting harmony. The cycle was his now,